Do you have enough in-country support for maintenance of your equipment, installation, because it's costly? Yeah, the HPV test is costly. So do you have enough support in that sense?
Look, again, this is something that varies country to country, and it's a very complex issue. I know before COVID, there was 425 HPV assays commercially available, but only a handful of them, less than 20, had actually been clinically validated. And some of those were only used in 1 or 2 laboratories in the world, so were not something that was readily available. When we talk about a HPV test, we want something that is clinically validated. We want something that will detect the HPVs that are associated with disease, but won't give us lots of false positives that will lead to overtreatment or overdiagnosis or, all of those things we spoke about earlier. But you also want a machine that you can get serviced. And with our machines, if we don't service them every year, it won't run any samples. So finding, certain countries, I know there's a really high volume machine in a small area called New Caledonia, which is a Pacific island. And I think with the size of their machine, they could probably test everyone in the country by the end of the year. And so we know that machine's supported. So we'd probably look at using a test for that machine. One of the good things about COVID is people have these machines and they're using them for COVID or for tuberculosis or for HIV or for anything else. And so if the machine's already there and it's already being serviced, just putting on the HPV pod won't actually add to those costs. And look, we know that the amount of countries that are able to do PCR tests I think it's probably close to 100% post-COVID. So it's about finding what infrastructure, what support is available in your area and trying to piggyback, trying to utilize that rather than starting from scratch and trying to build it up from nothing, which is what we had to do earlier on.
Are there hidden costs that we should know about?
So I think if we look at the costs, so obviously you've got the device, you've got the liquid, you've got the HPV test, you've got the machine, so you have to service the machine. But generally it's pretty straightforward, and laboratories that are doing other types of testing, again, tuberculosis, HIV, this is something they've been doing for decades, and that's sort of built into how we actually structure these approaches.
What about requirements for storage? Any supply chain management issues that you've encountered?
So, look, during COVID, it got very interesting at various different times. But again, there is a different test depending on your environment. So again, we have a specialist lab. We're doing 1,000 HPV tests a day. I have big freezers. I have rooms that I can store things. If you're only, you're a small rural hospital, you might not have those things, but I can think of at least 2 clinically validated tests that don't actually require refrigerators. You can keep everything on those shelves next to the machine. And that's obviously very appealing. If you're a major laboratory in a major urban centre and you're doing 500, 1,000 tests a day, that will also influence what you want. So again, some of these machines, the smallest that I've actually seen myself and used, can do about, in 8 hours, we can do about 13 tests. The largest that I've seen can do over 2,000 in a day. And exactly what test you need depends on what your storage options are. And in terms of supply chain, again, that can be really difficult depending on the country. But again, we now have the benefits of having all of this stuff set up for COVID. And it's always surprised me. It's amazing how quickly supply chains get sorted out when there's a lot of money involved. And now we've actually done a lot of work to have those more robust. And a number of the big manufacturers that actually started putting manufacturing plants outside of the UK, outside of Europe, outside of the US, in a lot of areas, particularly, in Asia, there's now manufacturing plants, so we don't have to wait for things to come from a very long way away.
Okay, how many centres do you actually have around Australia to do these tests? I mean, is it, do you need it all over the place? Or, as you said, in some remote areas, you need to go further away. Has that been a problem for Australia? I mean, it's a huge country.
Yeah, look, I mean, exactly how many labs you have is probably more to your country. So in Australia, we have a mixture of government and private laboratories. And last I heard, we had about 30 different laboratories doing HPV testing. But originally there was only 3 that were able to do the swab. In New Zealand, they have a tender and they've got 3 different labs doing all the screening, all in their country, and they're using 3 different machines. our laboratory does probably about 13-14% of the screening in Australia, and we're one small laboratory, but we get samples from all over Australia. As I said, we showed that these samples are valid for 28 days. We originally did 14 days, and we had nurses going out to these very remote communities. They'd drive out, they'd be out there for a week, they'd drive back to the centre, they'd put things in a post letter and send them to us. And our postal service is not as good as it used to be, so sometimes things would take a lot longer. So what we did is we extended to just try and find out how long they could wait. And 28 days seems to be a really comfortable area, and we've just stopped there because generally we're not having too many issues. But yeah, you can have one lab for an entire country if they have that capacity. Places like Samoa I've been lucky enough to go to, they only have about 37,000 eligible women in the entire country. So if you're doing screening over a 10-year period, that's 3,500 women a year. You can absolutely do that with a single laboratory.
There's a project in Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea now. Have you been involved in that?
Yeah, so this is something that ACPCC has been involved in. As a technical person, we have some real experts in the technical side managing the on-the-ground aspects of that. I've been asked to some of the work on how to make sure that we have really robust quality, but yeah, it's a really interesting program because it's all being done as point of care testing, because you can draw everything back to that central laboratory, but if you're out in these remote areas, to get it back to the central laboratory, you have to take it. So if it takes you 3 days each way, it's not going to be particularly effective. Plus, if somebody, even in these remote areas, it might still take them a day or 2 days to get to those centres. So it takes you 3 days to get there, it takes 3 days to get back, then 2 days to go and find the person. It's not going to be very effective, and it's going to take a lot of time. So something where you can get a rapid result, so the point of care instruments can get a result within an hour, will allow those who do have abnormalities to be followed up more effectively. And as you said, the WHO says screen 70% of people but follow up 90%. So that 90% is where we're really focusing on with those rapid tests.
So that'll be a good project to follow, actually. Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea. David, you spoke about clinically validated. I mean, I think that those two words have been bandied around a fair bit. What does it actually mean?
Sure. So that's a phrase that I put into my bag of things, weasel words. Exactly what it means depends on what you're talking about. So when we talk about clinically validated for a COVID test, what we want to do is we want to detect virus that is COVID virus and not detect virus that's not COVID virus. So it's pretty simple. If you have a swab and it gives you a positive result, you should have COVID, which is caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. You shouldn't have flu. You shouldn't have a bacterial infection. That's clinically validated for the majority of testing. HPV is a little bit different because obviously a lot of these infections clear 90% within a couple of years. We don't want to detect every single last molecule of HPV because otherwise we're just going to send everybody to the specialists and I'll get a lot of angry phone calls. What we do want to detect is we want to detect HPV at a level of which it's going to be clinically relevant associated with disease. So probably the closest analogy is I'm a nearly 50-year-old male. I have to have my cholesterol checked. Now, I should have cholesterol. That's something I do need to have, but too high can be a problem. But again, it really depends on my age and history. HPV is quite similar. We want to detect HPV where it's going to be likely, not always, but likely to be associated with either precancerous disease or a heightened risk of precancerous disease. So there's a number of different ways of doing it. It depends on whether you're testing the assay, you're testing the device, you're testing the collection, but basically you want to test that it's going to be sensitive for high-grade precancerous disease, but also specific so you don't get lots of false positives and lots of people being sent to specialist care when they don't need it.
And you also said something about point of care when we were talking about Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu. What did you mean by that?
Sure. So point of care is certainly something that has become much more available with COVID. We've had point of care at the airport where you had to get tested and they would check you out. Rapid Tests are also a form of point of care, but again, they're not very controlled. I know that I've made mistakes with taking samples myself, and I really shouldn't. I've been doing this for quite a while. But a point of care device is generally something that's, I think of it as the size of a microwave or smaller. So anything bigger than that is not really going to be point of care. It's something that should be able to sit on your kitchen bench, again, next to your coffee machine. That gives you an idea of the size of the machine we're talking about. But it's also something that can give you a rapid result. So if you have that machine and you put it in, you have to wait 4 hours, it's not going to be really effective, because again, point of care is going to be in your primary care clinic. You'll go and see the doctor. They'll say, oh, we need to do a test. You'll take the sample, you do test result, and then you'll get that. Again, the fastest HPV test is within an hour. Now, that's fantastic, and everyone asks me, it's like, why don't we just have that everywhere? And that would be awesome. The problem is the technology for a point of care test. So in a lab, we'll have little plastic things to move the liquids around. We'll have an area to process the samples. We'll have these big machines. We'll have all these computers. In a point of care, it's generally one or two things. So you put a sample in, again, it looks like a slightly larger coffee pod. You put it in the machine and you press play, and you'll get a result within an hour. Obviously, to get everything in one tiny part is more expensive. If anyone's looked at a smartwatch, again, a smartwatch is sometimes more expensive than a phone, which is 3 or 4 times the size, even though it has less functions, because trying to get something compact and robust is more complicated. And again, these are also designed so they don't need fridges, because your GP or your primary care clinic normally spaces at a premium. And so we need something that's going to be easy to use. The other thing is, I'm a clinical scientist. I've been a scientist for nearly 20 years. I like to think that I've had all this training. I've made a lot of mistakes to know what to do and what is important. When you have somebody who's working at a clinic, there's someone who's clinically trained, is medically trained. They're great at working with people and identifying symptoms, taking tests. But running a laboratory test is probably not something that is their expertise. So what we need is something that's going to be easy and simple to run. And again, there's a price associated with those. The Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu are really useful, because taking it to a centralized lab is going to be detrimental. People won't get their results. They won't be followed up. If you're in Melbourne, you can have your test taken. It'll be in our lab. You'll probably have the result back in a day or two, and then we'll call you. We can even go around to your house. We know people have addresses, people have postal boxes, people have phones. It's really easy to contact them. It's not that simple in a lot of other environments. So exactly whether you go for a point of care or whether you go for a central lab or a small lab or any combination in between will really depend on not your country, not even your city. It will depend on the unique setting of your primary care.
And if a country were to start to think about screening, based on what you've spoken to us about, what would be first steps?
Look, I think the first step is to understand who you want to screen, how often you want to screen, and those things. Because if you want to screen, the WHO screens every woman by the age of 35 and then again by the age of 45. Okay, we know how many women we have over the age of 30 and between the age of 35, so you know how many. I'll use Samoa because, again, I hope I remember those figures accurately. It's about 30,000, 37,000 women in the entire country. So if we want to screen them over 10 years, we're looking about 3,500 screening tests. We'll probably have some follow-ups. So if we round it up to, say, 4,000. So if we need to do 4,000 tests a year, then we look at the settings. So do we have a hospital? Do we already have a lab? Do we need to do point of care? Are there remote areas we need to contact? So work out who you're going to screen, how often you're going to screen, and how many. Once you get that will give you an idea of what you need. Now, there's a list of clinically validated assays. It's updated very regularly. I think we're nearly 20, and it's a list of 20. A couple of those are not really available anymore, so it's maybe only 15. So instead of 425 assays, you've got 15. So then I'd look at your lab and go, oh, we've got that machine, that machine, that machine. okay, so we've got 3 of those machines already. This is going to be much cheaper and easier. And then you can just work with your government, with the manufacturers and with your lab to work out what will work best for your situation.
David, we've spoken about overdiagnosing. You mentioned there are over 200 subtypes. Am I correct with the 200 subtypes?
229 at the moment.
To be exact. And you don't want to test for too many subtypes as well. You spoke about the 12 subtypes, but how much do we really test for? Is it, how few, or if we have to do the minimal, what would they be?
Sure. Look, that's a really good question. As I said, look, the advice from the International Papillomavirus Society, and in fact, all of those, slightly less than 20 clinically validated assays, only one of them doesn't use 13 or 14 and they uses 15. So we have sort of that fixed number. And the reason we have that fixed number is because those types are associated with cancer. So I've said HPV 16 and 18 account for about 70% of cancers. And we're certainly aware that people are trying to market assays that just test for those two. And look, that's okay. But I don't think we want to reduce cervical cancer by 70%, even if we tested and identified all of them. Particularly the problem with those is we've had a vaccine for 16 years targeting exactly those 2 types. So if you have a vaccinated population and you're only testing for those 2 types, you're going to miss potentially most of the cancers caused by the other types. So we have these 14. So those 16 and 18 make up 70% of cancers. There's another 5 that are in the next generation of vaccine called the Gardasil 9, which was, I believe, accredited in 2014 in the US. And those 5 make up another 15 to 20%. It varies a little bit. And then we have another 7 types, which probably account for about 5% of cancers. So they're the ones they're talking about now. 16, 18, again, they cause the majority of cancers, but we need to test for the others because 25% of cancers is still a lot of cancers. And if we're not testing for those, we will not identify them. And they are the group that are not actually going to get really any protection from the vaccination that's currently available in those who are in the screening age. So the 13 or 14 types is designed to try and get the balance between detecting the HPV-associated cancers, but also not giving you too many false positives. So the work, I think the first longitudinal, so the long-term 10-year study of looking what happens if you get a HPV negative 10 years later, I believe that came out in 2005, so nearly 20 years ago. There's been a lot of work. There's, in the Australian program, we did over 3.5 million HPV screening tests in the first 2 years. There's millions and millions of these tests, and we follow up those people, and we know the value of why we test for the amount of types we test for. Not too many, not too few. It's a bit of the Goldilocks zone of molecular testing.
So for everybody listening in right now, what will be your message?
This is not difficult. This was something that was intimidating. In Melbourne, one city, we have a state of 6.6 million people. We got up to 200,000 COVID PCR tests a day. We could screen our entire population of eligible women in a month. This used to be something that was intimidating. COVID has shown this is something that's just a matter of allocating the resources and also acknowledging that it is not just a test, it is part of a screening program, and investing in the people that will actually speak to the women will get them to understand why they should do this, why it's important, and to make sure that if they do find something, they're supported in both understanding what it means, but also in getting the care they do as follow-up.
Thank you for joining us, David. Associate Professor David Hawkes, Director of the Molecular Microbiology Unit at Australian Centre for the Prevention of Cervical Cancer. Thank you.
Thanks.